Good afternoon. My name is Ron Weich. I'm the Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's installment of our UB Law in Focus series. This afternoon's webinar is entitled Aftermath of an Election, Constitutional Perspectives. Well, the 2020 election certainly provided a lot of food for thought. We had record voter turnout. We had a historic outcome, including the election of the first woman and the first woman of color to serve as Vice President of the United States. And the aftermath has itself been unprecedented in many ways. So over the next hour, our four panelists, all members of the UB School of Law faculty, will share their thoughts about the conduct of the election, President Trump's refusal to concede, the lawsuits challenging the outcome, the Electoral College, and we'll even take a sneak peek at the Biden administration and how it might function under our Constitution. And I want to emphasize that we're not political pundits here. We are law professors, and this will be an examination of the election through the lens of constitutional and election law. We very much invite our audience members to participate. I will serve as the moderator, and I'll get the discussion started. But very quickly, I hope to turn to questions from our audience. You can use the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard, and I will field those questions and put them to our panelists. This is our final webinar in the series for this year, but we will resume next year. And on January 27th, we have a webinar scheduled that will be a look at racial issues in transportation policy. And you can learn more about that and register on the UB Law website. So now let me introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Professor Gilda Daniels joined the UB Law faculty in 2006. She teaches civil procedure, election law, and other subjects. Professor Daniels is the author of the book Uncounted, The Crisis of Voter Suppression in America, published earlier this year. Before coming to UB, she served as a deputy chief in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. She's also the litigation director at the Advancement Project, a nonprofit group advocating for civil rights and fair elections. Professor Kimberly Whaley teaches administrative law, civil procedure, federal courts, and other subjects here at UB, where she's been since 2009. Kim is a frequent analyst on various media outlets, including NBC, CBS, and the BBC. Among other publications, Professor Whaley is the author of How to Read the Constitution and Why, that was published last year, and What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, published earlier this year. Professor Greg Dolan joins us. He joined the faculty at UB in 2011, where he teaches property, torts, and intellectual property. Professor Dolan is actually on leave from our school because he's serving as an associate justice on the Supreme Court of the Pacific Nation of Palau. Greg is an active member of the Federalist Society and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, the Center on Constitutional Studies, and a senior fellow at the American Conservative Union Foundation. So Greg brings a somewhat different perspective to this discussion, and we welcome that. And finally, Professor Charles Tiefer teaches legislation and government contracts at UB. Before joining our faculty in 1995, Charles served as solicitor and deputy general counsel of the United States House of Representatives for 11 years. He's the author most recently of a book entitled The Polarized Congress, published in 2016, and Charles writes regularly for Forbes magazine. So thank you, panelists, for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to our guests, and let's get started. Let's look back at this election. In the run-up to the election, Gilda Daniels, you were outspoken in expressing concern about voter suppression, and yet we saw record turnout. So was the vote not suppressed, or was there still suppression?
I'm so grateful to be on this panel tonight, and thank you so much, Dean Weich, for having me. So wanted to, in regards to voter suppression, yes, voter suppression certainly occurred. There were, certainly during the early voting period, as well as on election day, and we did see record turnout, but we also saw very high levels of voter intimidation and as well as efforts to deter and thwart voter participation. For example, things such as in the state of Texas, where the governor decided that the counties could only have one drop box per county, where counties like Harris County, which is the third largest county in the United States, and where Houston, Texas is located, had previously decided they would have 12 drop boxes. And so to move from 12 drop boxes to one certainly is an example of a way of suppressing the vote. And also seeing these long lines because of having one drop box, many people decided that they would vote in person, and so you had long lines of people voting, and to have people stand in line for 4 hours, 5 hours, and in Georgia certainly people stayed in line for more than 10 hours. There were people who stayed in line for 11 hours in places like Georgia. Here in Maryland, during early voting, in Prince George's County, people were in line for 4 hours. So these kinds of measures certainly continue to demonstrate how voter suppression is real. And in places like Georgia, where people were trying to assist people to vote, those efforts were supported certainly in many efforts by county level. And it's also important to point out vote intimidation was widespread, particularly in places like Florida, where certainly Advancement Project was monitoring Florida, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and other states. But in Florida, and particularly in places like Pennsylvania, where you have open carry laws and that weapons were present, certainly vote intimidation, voter suppression was in effect on Election Day during the early voting period, as well as on Election Day. And so the voter suppression is real.
There. Well, thanks. It seems to me you helped shine a light on those problems in advance of the election, and maybe that helped alleviate some of the suppression, but you say it's an ongoing problem, so it's something for future elections. Kim Whaley, you had many warnings about foreign interference in the election. Does it appear that those warnings were unnecessary, or at least that the foreign interference that you feared didn't materialize?
Well, we know from the President Trump, the Trump administration's top cybersecurity expert, who he just actually fired this week, that this was, according to that commission, the safest election in the history of American elections. I don't think that we can assume foreign interference is not going to happen going forward. There were certainly fears of it. We haven't heard reports where any actual votes were changed through, some kind of hacking, for example. But of course, in 2016, one of the, if you read the Mueller report and, former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein's talks about foreign interference in 2016, one of the primary mechanisms for doing that was voter disinformation. So getting on Facebook, getting on Twitter, pretending to be an American that, had information about that was turned out to be false about certain races, et cetera. Foreigners, primarily Russians, putting that into cyberspace. I think the difference, and unfortunately, quite sadly, in 2020, is that misinformation is actually coming from the White House, members of Congress, the United States government. So that's, I think, the new frontier that we're still battling in this moment when it comes to the legitimacy of what happened on November 3rd. And I agree with Professor Daniels, having looked at this, that voter suppression, unfortunately, is here to stay domestically, in part because the Voting Rights Act was essentially gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013, and because we don't have an express right to vote. But I want to say a lot of the concerns that people like myself and Professor Daniels in the election space had leading up to November 3rd did not materialize in ways that really could have been catastrophic. And I think we as Americans need, and frankly, the people across the globe who care about democracy, owe a huge thank you to the 700,000 plus people who are on the front lines of managing this electoral process: volunteers, poll workers, counters, election officials. These are not people engaged in malfeasance or fraud. Some of them have personal security details because, unfortunately, the misinformation has trickled down to their day-to-day lives. But I just want to say this is really actually a strong moment in American democracy, that notwithstanding not just foreign interference, but other aspects, assaults on our electoral process so far have not been successful. American democracy survived this round, and I think that is really cause for celebration, notwithstanding all the
Good to
anxiety
hear.
and concerns.
Thanks. Charles Tiefer, I want to ask you about another aspect of the run-up to the election, and that was concerns about the post office's ability, the U.S. Post Office's ability to process all of the mail-in ballots. And there was some congressional activity. The Postmaster General was called up for oversight hearings. Do you feel that that had an impact on the success of the election, as Kim Whaley has just described it?
Well, it was almost surprising. The answer is yes. People have been saying House hearings oversight doesn't have an effect. It's pushed away, ignored. Postmaster Louis DeJoy stood accused and with support from many documents that he had cut out overtime, extra mail trips, and other ways that the post office was going to move the mail ballots along with all the other mail at the time. He was brought up by the House Government Reform and Oversight Committee, and it was perhaps the most contentious oversight hearing of the entire Congress, where he bent and said, I will mend my ways. In effect, he said he would get the overtime back going, and there was no scandal as there would have been about mail ballots not getting to their destination.
So that's, again, good news. But I want to say in all of this, the various concerns that were expressed before the election may have had the effect of addressing, as Charles just described. I'm thinking of Justice Ginsburg's famous quote in the voting rights case, the Shelby County case, where she said, we shouldn't throw away an umbrella in a rainstorm because we're not getting wet. Maybe that we need the umbrella. We need the kind of vigilance that you've all described and that several of you participated in to make sure that things were right. Let me ask Greg Dolan, who, as I said, brings a somewhat different perspective to these questions. Were you surprised that the election was as successful as it was, Greg? And you're muted, Greg, unmute.
Yeah, I'm muted. So first of all, Ron, thanks for having me on this panel. I suspect, unlike everybody else, I'm probably the only one on this panel who voted for President Trump's re-election. But that out of the way, I want to say that I don't necessarily speak for the president or agree with everything he's done before or after the election. But I will try to bring some sort of conservative perspective, not necessarily the presidential perspective, to this discussion. Now, on to your question. To be honest, I am not surprised. I always thought that a lot of the concerns that were raised in the media, while legitimate, were somewhat overwrought, including with the post office issues. A lot of the things that were being done are just apparently are constantly done by the post office. The post boxes are changed, things are moved around. I don't know if we can say that the congressional oversight changed anything. It seems to me that maybe it has, but it seems to me just simply saying that we had hearings and things went well is a bit of a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. But ultimately, I'm not surprised. I think our election, one of the strengths of the federalism is that our elections are very hard to hack and are very hard to influence because we're running it in at least 50 jurisdictions and perhaps more because some states, different counties run it differently. And it's difficult to affect maliciously those elections when they're so decentralized. And so ultimately, I'm not surprised it went well. I kind of expected it to go well. I didn't expect to be, I guess, that close across all the levels of voting. But yeah, but then again, I thought the 2016 election went well, and the election that never ended, the 2000 election, I thought ultimately went well. So I'm not.
Well, so Greg raises the question of the decentralized election, which of course occurs because we have an electoral college, and our law students and lawyers generally are familiar with that constitutional institution, not a college at all, but a manner of choosing the president. And one of the audience members has already asked, is it time to junk the Electoral College? If we look at the results, we see that Vice President Biden is leading, votes still being counted in some places, but the overall margin is over 5 million votes in favor of Vice President Biden. And yet, some have pointed out that if you look at the margin in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin altogether, it's only about 45,000 votes. So we came pretty close to having the third instance in recent years in which the loser of the popular vote might be elected with the Electoral College structure. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists, is it time to lose the Electoral College? Let me start with Kim. for this one?
Well, I think that is a question that I get asked all the time. It's something that is on a lot of Americans' minds, and part of it is, I think, a basic misunderstanding and lack of civics around our electoral process. So the fact that we are having this discussion, I think, is a great thing. Number one, though, amending the Constitution to, quote, get rid of the Electoral College is virtually impossible. It takes both Congress, House of Congress, and supermajority of the state legislatures to do that. That's not to say, though, that we can't see changes in the Electoral College that would avoid, as you indicated, would be the fifth time in American history, maybe this time, where we would have seen the popular vote sort of drowned out by the Electoral College, because the margins of the popular vote are certainly much larger than 45,000. And I think it hits people on a very just sort of gut fairness level, that the popular vote somehow could be so contingent on close elections. So where we have a problem is where the margins are slim. So how could this change? Well, every state, and we're having this discussion now when it comes up to critical dates, December 8th, December 14th, January 6th, where all of these states' slates of electors are actually registered. So when a state makes a decision or the popular vote comes in, the entire state slate of electors goes to whoever got the majority of votes or plurality of votes in that state, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska. So it's a winner-take-all system. That's why you can have a popular vote that is different from the Electoral College vote. Effectively, in the Electoral College, the people who voted for a minority candidate who did not win that state get canceled out in the Electoral College. The way to change that would be for states to change the way they direct their electors to actually vote in the Electoral College, to do it in a different way, maybe proportional, maybe based on members of Congress, like I said, Maine and Nebraska do. Also, there's floating around interstate compact, where the states would say, listen, if we have a popular vote in enough states that would make 270 votes to go with the Electoral College, we will go to the popular vote. We'll ignore our state law and go with the popular vote for that particular election. There aren't enough states in this moment. I think recently one state did join for that to change. But people need to understand we can fix the Electoral College by electing people to the state legislatures who will direct their electors to vote differently without actually amending the Constitution. I think some thought needs to be put into that, in part because the Electoral College is a vestige of history that has connotations that are frankly racist. I mean, part of the reason for the compromise of the Electoral College was because of a hugely enslaved population in the South. And that just has no place, I think, in our current system of government. At a minimum, it's time to reconsider it.
Important history. Gilda, is it your view that the Electoral College, in part because of its racist roots, should
I'm so glad that Professor
overcome?
I'm so glad that Professor Willie pointed out certainly the racist roots of the Electoral College, but we also see contemporaneously that it certainly has problems, because it's particularly when it doesn't demonstrate the will of the people. And so you certainly, there is a national popular vote movement that is occurring. There are approximately 16 states that have actually passed a national popular vote interstate compact, which essentially says that their votes will go to the person that receives the popular vote. So there is a movement of sorts to address certainly the shortfalls of the Electoral College. I do think that it's a thing of the past, that we need to, there are a number of things that we need to change about our electoral system, and I certainly think the Electoral College is one of those things.
Charles, you've been studying issues around this for a long time. How do you feel about the Electoral College?
I'll put it briefly. You could do it besides by a new constitutional amendment. You could do it if we have a constitutional convention, and the movement to bring about such a convention could draw from the grievances in different states. I'm not pushing it. That's chaos, but that's how it could be done.
Yeah. And Greg, I think I've heard you say that you suggested in your earlier comment, you're content with the current system. Is that right?
And I just want to bring up 2 points. So first, there's nothing wrong with pointing out that Donald Trump lost popular vote twice, as did George Bush in 2000. But and that's fine, and it's a great political talking point. But I'm not really sure what conclusion is to be drawn from that. In part because the results are not exogenous to the system, they're endogenous to the system, meaning that there's no guarantee that, for example, if we had a popular vote election and reran it known ex ante, that if the winner of popular vote would win, the results would be the same as they are in electoral college winning. So for example, especially in election 2016, California was, given that it's going to go to Hillary Clinton. On top of that, there was a Senate election in California under their sort of somewhat unique system. The two candidates who were running were both Democrats. I think it was Kamala Harris was running, and I think, or maybe Dianne Feinstein, and
Kevin DeLeon, state legislator, ran against Dianne Feinstein.
So, but the point is, there was absolutely no reason for Republicans to come out and vote. They knew that the president is going to lose, or the presidential candidate is going to lose their state. They had no kind of other top ticket item there, and so I could see the apathy. And then, same thing is probably true for some Democrats in Alabama. And people can say, well, they should still come out and vote. That's their civic duty. That may be. My point is simply that our results are somewhat endogenous to the system we have it up front. And I'm not necessarily saying it's a better system, but or worse system, but that should be recognized. And the second point is sort of to address what Kim was saying in terms of maybe keeping electoral college because it's difficult to do away with, but perhaps rejiggering it some other way. So as Ron, as you know, we've had kind of the pre-meeting for this. And afterwards I went online, and actually there are websites you could, select your preferred system, and it will tell you how the election would come out. And under almost any system that Kim suggested would come out the same way, except I think in 2012, that if you, I think, award by congressional district, Romney would have beaten out Obama. So, you can rejigger it, and maybe then the result would approximate a little bit closer to what national popular vote is, but I don't think it would actually change all that much. And if it does, possibly it would actually bring a bit more of a Republican bias in the Electoral College. Right. But finally, I think just one last quick thing. I think I would rather keep it just because, we're different states, and California should do things their own way, and Iowa should do things their own way, and one state shouldn't have to be able to completely dominate the other. So that's why I support the Electoral College.
I just want to add there, Ron, I mean, there are a lot of different ways of actually apportioning votes. So I'm not sure what Professor Dolan was looking at, but I don't have a particular opinion about how to do it. And until you sort of did that data analysis, it's impossible to tell how the last elections would come out, because it'd be a state by state determination of how the things would be proportional. My point is, that it smacks of unfairness. It polarizes us. We don't need more reasons to be polarized. I think I mentioned this in the pre-call as well. Mo Rocca, a comedian for, also a CBS commentator, did a simulation of this with first graders. Do they like markers better, or do they like colored pencils? The markers won the popular vote, the colored pencils won the Electoral College, and the kids were really, really upset. So even if it came out the same way under a different system, if we could buy into the system, I think that would be really good for democracy.
Yeah, one thing I'll observe, remember, and I hope the students on the call know this, that the Electoral College votes awarded to each state are essentially the congressional delegation, including the two senators. So the unrepresentative nature of the Senate, North Dakota, Vermont, the small states, Wyoming, which get two senators, get those two electoral votes as well. So it kind of augments or echoes the unrepresentative nature of the Senate. Now, there are important reasons for the Senate. Charles and I both have worked in the Congress, and I think have great respect for the institution of the Senate, but counting the electoral votes the way we do certainly gives those small states an additional say in the choice of president. And as both Kim Whaley and Gilda Daniels have said, there's a racial history there.
That's true. Just one quick thing. I mean, sure. It's the nature of the federal system. Christine and I, maybe a couple of years ago, we had this conversation, and again, out of curiosity, I went online and looked at other systems that are somewhat more federal. And for example, in the United Kingdom, which consists of 4 separate countries, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the number of seats per population, for example, that Scotland gets is much different than what England gets. And so I think English voters weight only about half as much as a Scottish voter, and only 1/3 as much as a Northern Irish voter. Now, because they're, perhaps it's not as unrepresentative, but this is not unique to us. So whenever you have a system that's federalism, when you bring in disparate political units, you do have some of that unequal weighing. And I think that's actually a strength, not a weakness of the federal system.
All right. Let's turn to the aftermath of the election, which is to say President Trump's refusal to concede and litigation in different states. And I want to ask a question that one of the audience members has posed in the Q&A. He or she notes that some have suggested that President Trump could stay in office through the 12th Amendment if he does not concede. Well, here's a constitutional issue that we don't get to tackle very much, the 12th Amendment. Kim, do you want to take a stab at telling us how that might work if we ever got to that point?
Well, it's hard to, under the Constitution, under the 20th Amendment, Donald Trump ceases to be president of the United States as of noon on January 20th, 2021. And I think that's really the dispositive moment. That is, he becomes a private citizen. So staying in the White House would be a trespass, just like a regular person, that he would be subjected to violating trespass laws like a regular civilian. The way, I think what the question is about is really what happens in a contested election. And there are a lot of sort of wickets, frankly, that we do need to get through between now and January 20th. It can be a bit complicated, so let me just sort of summarize it. Essentially, all of it depends on the good faith of representatives in the state legislatures and representatives in the United States Congress. All of it depends on adhering to democratic norms and the peaceful transition of power and a reality check as far as what the election results are and how they're being certified by the state election officials. So as of December 8th, that's sort of what's called the safe harbor deadline, where states could, in theory, if there was a dispute within how to count their electoral votes, states could meet and decide to hand their votes to someone other than the person who got the popular vote. That would be a huge deal. On the 14th, the actual electors are supposed to meet and cast their slates of electors as certified by the states. The certification dates are at various times depending on the state. My guess is that's going to actually move just fine. The wrinkle, and perhaps Professor Tiefer has some thoughts on this, on January 6th, the United States Congress meets, and Vice President Pence will gavel in then the various slates of electors by state. It's possible in that moment, if there were a state where it was legitimately disputed who got the slate of electors, that a Republican, for example, from the House and a Republican from the Senate could decide to challenge that particular slate. Then the chambers separate, they deliberate on what to do about that. If the Senate, if the Republicans, for example, were to say, listen, we think that Wisconsin is not legitimate based on unsubstantiated, in this moment, claims of voter fraud, that would definitely send us into a very difficult moment. Under the sort of the 12th Amendment and the Succession Act put together, the House of Representatives in a contested election then could vote up or down based on state by state, and the states would be, whether you're Republican or Democrat, would depend on the majority of members of the House in that state. And so at last count, I think it would go to Donald Trump if that were to happen. Of course, it's the same ballot now, the president and the vice president. The Senate would vote on, if that couldn't be resolved, the Senate would then vote on the vice presidency. If the Republican-led Senate chose Mike Pence over Kamala Harris, then he would become president pending a resolution in the House of Representatives. If none of that worked out, then the Succession Act would kick in and the House Speaker, presumably Nancy Pelosi, would become president pending resolution and all that.
Wow.
But if again, members of all of these legislatures went along with the popular vote and certification by states, we'd all be fine. So it comes down to political will.
Yeah, we haven't seen this kind of scenario of it being resolved in the Congress since 1876 in the Tilden Hayes election. But you raised the interesting question of the vice president presiding over this, and of course he's on the ballot. He had been on the ballot. Charles, while there's no law on this, do you understand the vice president to have discretion in how he would kind of handle and preside in that situation, or is he simply a function of the majority of the body?
We have seen it before. There was an objection, of course, there was an objection during Bush v. Gore when Al Gore was both vice president and was the losing candidate for president. There was even a fluke of an objection in 1960 when Richard Nixon was vice president and was the candidate for president. And in both instances, they in effect presided over their own demise. Gore gavelled down the efforts of Black members of the House to say that there were bad things that had occurred during the voting. I think there's sort of two levels of fighting. One is whether there's an objection. And as Kim said, that only takes one senator and one representative to put together an objection to a vote by a particular state, let's say Pennsylvania. And it wouldn't surprise me if there was an objection this year. You know, Rand Paul and a colleague could do it. But to throw that puts the vote before the House. But to actually have the House stage a coup and the Republican Party in the House decide that they want their guy to be president, I leave to the audience to figure out whether that's likely.
All right. Well, let's talk just a minute about these cases that have been brought by the president and his allies, but they don't seem to be very successful. Gilda, you're probably keeping a close eye on those. What's your assessment? Are any of these lawsuits going to gain traction?
Well, they have been highly unsuccessful and in many respects frivolous, meritless lawsuits that have been brought. For example, some of the lawsuits, I think the ones that that have actually been won had to do with moving observers, poll watchers, from 10 feet away to 6 feet away. Right, but the throwing out millions of ballots, hundreds of thousands of ballots, and saying that the reason for doing so is because of voting irregularities and voter fraud has been highly unsuccessful. Though in those instances, certainly courts have said there is absolutely no evidence of voter fraud or voting irregularities, and certainly not to the level that would change outcomes. There is still, a lawsuit. The Trump administration sought to intervene in the case that's in Pennsylvania that's before the United States Supreme Court, and the state of Pennsylvania certainly drafted their brief that essentially said that they should not be allowed to intervene, that the Republican Party is representative of the Trump administration, so they should not be allowed to intervene. We're still waiting on to see what the Supreme Court will do, or if that will actually rise to the level of having the Supreme Court. And then again, this is certainly what the Trump administration said it wanted to do all the time, which is it wanted the courts to decide, not for the people to decide. And I think certainly having the large margin of victory, certainly for for President-elect Biden, certainly destroys that argument. Particularly, we're not in a Bush v. Gore situation where Bush v. Gore was about one state, and here they're trying to change the outcome in approximately 6 states, and they are highly unsuccessful and will fail.
Greg, in the circles that you travel in, conservative lawyers, those at the Federal Society and elsewhere, do you anticipate, do people you talk to anticipate that these lawsuits will change any results in the states?
Well, just as by way of a footnote, I would say the Federal Society, of course, has no views. We don't take positions on it. Obviously, people in it have views, but the society itself doesn't. And I think, that's important to always point out. But in any event, circles that I travel in right now due to COVID mostly involve like my bedroom and the couch, which my dog mostly occupies. She has no particular opinion on this election. But, I think the lawsuits are probably going to be unsuccessful. There may be, a couple hundred or a couple thousand votes changed here and there. I can even see potentially one state that's particularly close, Wisconsin flipping hypothetically, but I think even that's unlikely. I don't see, 3 or 4 states flipping. there may be some meritorious legal claims. Again, I'm not necessarily an electoral law expert, but for example, there's been a litigation going back and forth on Pennsylvania Supreme Court, somewhat changing the rules of the election, and maybe that was improper. But again, I think Pennsylvania margin is sufficiently high that I don't think that's going to matter, even if Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision, for example, to allow ballots to arrive after the election to count, contrary to their state law. Ultimately, I think there may be some merit to some legal claims. In terms of, is there merit to the relief requested? Unless there's some sort of grand conspiracy that none of us see coming, which I don't believe in, but I don't see it coming out any differently. Maybe
Okay.
a few thousand votes here and there.
I mean, Kim, do you see, is it wrong for lawyers to bring these suits? How do you see that? Some have criticized the lawyers themselves for being involved.
Yeah, well, I'm Professor Daniels and I both teach civil procedure, and I had this conversation earlier with my first years about this because we were talking about pleading. So yeah, I think, some of these lawyers are pulling out and we don't know why, but they're asking to be dismissed from the cases, or they're withdrawing the case representation. And, there are, I think, latest 26 of them. And of course, as people on the call who are in law school or lawyers understand, you have to have a factual predicate as a basis for filing a lawsuit, and you have to have a legal predicate. And here, as Professor Daniels indicated, the factual predicate for alleging fraud just does not exist. In Pennsylvania, a judge pressed one of the lawyers and said over and over, and listen, where is there fraud? And he finally admitted there's not fraud. I think there was one case that was based on a sticky note that was left on someone's desk claiming that there's fraud. There's a thing that most people who have not been in law school don't necessarily understand, is that in the American system, you can file a garbage lawsuit. And I'm not saying all of these are garbage lawsuits, but we understand what that means. The filter comes after. The filter comes after you file it. The judge looks at it and then decides whether to allow it to go forward. The other side will file what's called a motion to dismiss. In other places in the world, there's some filter in advance. And because there are so many cases being filed that allege wrongdoing, there's a perception amongst the public, particularly in the Republicans. I think the last I saw, 7 or 8 out of 10 Republican voters believe that there is fraud there by virtue, in part, I would suspect, of this litigation ongoing. I get calls all the time around the world. Is there legitimacy? And that's just really corrosive to the rule of law. And I would say, people who pass the bar and agree to practice law under the ethical rules do have an obligation to not only comply with Rule 11, which is the federal rule for ensuring accuracy in pleadings and that you have a good faith, factual, and legal basis, but for also upholding the legitimacy of the American system of democracy itself. So, I think the answer to that, Dean Weich, is yes. I think lawyers do have a stake in this, and they need to think twice before they participate in it if they don't have a good cause to do so.
Let me go to
mention one thing.
Sure, go ahead.
I think this is also, I think it's very important for us to understand that these cases are not about winning. Right, I think none of these cases are not brought in order to win them, but they're certainly creating a narrative, and they are destructive to the system, and that lawyers should consider before signing their names to pleadings whether or not there is a factual basis or a legal basis for bringing these sorts of claims, not just in these kinds of lawsuits, but certainly in any lawsuits that they would put their names to.
Yeah,
I just want to jump in quickly on. Certainly, I agree that lawyers should not file frivolous lawsuits. As a judge in a very small place, but nonetheless, I see pretty terrible pleadings all the time, and that's a tax on the court, that's a tax on the public, that's a tax on litigants, and that's a bad thing. That having been said, look, if we're going to take serious the mantra count every vote and that all legal votes should count, then, even lawsuits that are going to overturn or, not count some, even few illegal votes are meritorious, or that may force to count some legal votes that weren't counted are meritorious. And, again, I don't think they're going to overturn the results, but as a result of some of these lawsuits and some of these recounts, there were some, couple thousand ballots uncovered in Georgia. Again, is Trump going to win because of those? No, probably not. But, that's not unimportant. as to the legitimacy point, look, I agree with Kim that it's important to have legitimacy. I think it's important to have faith that the system works. But at the same time, look, coming from the right side of the spectrum, it is somewhat heartening, I suppose, to hear concerns about the legitimacy of the election, given the fact that over the last 4+ years, oftentimes we've heard that Donald Trump is an illegitimate president, that he won because of the collusion with Russia, that he won because of various other machinations. And so I suppose if we're going to have this new conversation about legitimacy, I welcome it. But, I think
I'm going to cut us off.
Look in the mirror oftentimes and see, like,
Greg, I'm going to cut us off from litigating 2016.
No, but I'm just saying, like, it's not the election. It's a question of how do we approach this. And I think it's important that we all on the same page and not have, like, people hold to different standards.
So I want to go back to the audience question, if I may give the audience a say here, because someone asked a very good question, important question about gerrymandering. Remember that this election included a lot of down ballot races, including state legislative races, and those state legislators, along with governors, will be redistricting congressional districts based on the 2020 census. And so are we moving towards more gerrymandering, the question suggests, or is this move towards statewide commissions that would determine legislative districts taking hold? Gilda, I know you've thought a lot about this in teaching your election law class. You've thought about gerrymandering. Which direction are we headed in?
I just want to add one other point about legitimacy, and that is that I think our students are seeing the difference between talking points and evidence. That when we're bringing cases in court, that we need evidence. That it's not a public opinion. It is what facts and evidence do you have. Now, in regards to redistricting and gerrymandering, we certainly had a number of cases before the United States Supreme Court on redistricting and gerrymandering, a case from our state, case from Maryland, as well as other places. We also had a few ballot initiatives on ballots in states across the country that would have moved states to commissions as opposed to letting the legislators decide the boundaries for their districts. Will we see more? We did certainly. Generally, to the victor belongs the spoils, and certainly you mentioned the census. That's also an issue in regards to whether or not we will actually have an accurate census count, and whether or not even the count itself will be challenged. But those persons who were elected on November 3rd will be certainly will be the persons in many of these states that will be determining what the district lines are. In Maryland, we have a system where there is a commission, but really not a commission. There's not an independent commission that gets to draw the lines. I would think that we will certainly see certainly levels of gerrymandering, and then without Section 5, we only have Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to challenge, to make sure that those are non-discriminatory and fair. I think we'll see more litigation. We saw litigation, certainly more litigation over this election cycle than we've seen in any other time in history. I think we'll see litigation over whatever district lines are drawn here in 2022.
Kim, you've written about gerrymandering. Do you feel like we're making any progress towards moving away from the electors, the members of Congress choosing their own voters as opposed to the other way around?
Well, as Gilda mentioned, the Supreme Court said in a recent decision that issue has to be resolved through the political process. Don't come to the courts, even if there was arguably a colorable constitutional claim to how politicians carve up their districts. So one of the problems where we are based on that Rucho decision versus Common Cause is that we're sending gerrymandering back to gerrymandered politicians to fix. So there is an incentive. In that particular case, it wasn't Republicans or Democrats that were guilty of picking their voters. It's both sides of the aisle that do it, and it is corrosive to democracy. I mean, my view is like all of these issues, civic education is absolutely vital. The fact that we're having a conversation about whether gerrymandering is okay, about what is voter suppression, about what to do about the Electoral College is a good thing out of all of this chaos. I should also note a lot of this boils down to whether we have a functioning Congress, which we do not. Trump gets a lot of heat, but a lot of what is going wrong in our system is at the feet of the United States Congress. The first thing that the House of Representatives did when it went to Democratic control in 2018 was pass a statute or a bill called H.R. 1 that included not only provisions for same-day registration, automatic registration, which would vastly increase participation in the United States, which I don't know how anyone could good faith dispute that that's a good thing to have we the people actually decide our own elected leaders, but would have had some legislation around some independence in choosing commissions commission independence for purposes of deciding electoral districts. That hasn't gotten past Mitch McConnell, and it probably won't if the Republicans stay in control of the Senate. But it's important to understand there are ways of addressing this if we can get moderates from both sides to actually reach across the aisle and fix these things for the purposes of serving the American public, serving democracy, and not so much entrenching power. The framers of the Constitution understood that it's human nature to amass, entrench, and ultimately abuse power. That's not a Republican thing, it's not a Democratic thing. And these structures are in place to protect the people. And I do think gerrymandering can change, but it requires putting people in elected positions that are willing to maybe give up their own power for the broader sake of democracy and the electorate.
Thanks. So let's bring Charles into this. Charles, you worked in and have studied the Congress for many years, and the gerrymandering has become more sophisticated. Do you think that's had an effect on the functioning of Congress, as Kim just suggested?
Oh, no question, because the Congress today is far more polarized than in past years. There's no overlap between the Democratic representatives and the Republican president, or the Democratic senators and the Republican senators. You end up like one or two who could possibly vote against their party at most. And gerrymandering in the House is what produces districts that are the district itself. The lines are drawn to pack all the Democrats in one district, and you get a very left representative out of that process in the Democratic districts, and a very right Republican congressman out of the right districts. And so, yes, you see the effects. You don't see compromise anymore.
So, Greg, I'll give you a chance on gerrymandering before I turn to the Biden administration.
Look, yes, it's better than if we speak common language, and yes, the Congress is much more polarized now than before. As a skeptical person by nature, I don't know if there's necessarily a particularly fair way of doing it. There's slightly better and slightly worse ways. Again, so I've looked at how other countries do it, and it's almost everywhere. It still becomes political, even when it's done by so-called independent commission. You can improve on the margins. I don't know if you can solve all the problems, but I think the bigger problem is you can have all the independent commissions you want, and we can even pretend that they are in fact independent. The problem is our housing patterns. If you look at kind of the electoral maps from 1960s on, you would see in 60s and 70s, basically your neighbors were Democrats on the left and Republicans on the right, and some independent across the street from you. That's no longer true. That's no longer true. You can look at the county and say, this is a solidly Republican county and this is a solidly Democratic county. And that has nothing to do with gerrymandering. It's just how people are sorting themselves out. Ohio used to be a swing state. I went to high school in Illinois. Illinois used to be a swing state. Illinois, up until 2000, the entire 20th century supported every single winner in a presidential election state for Gerald Ford. They voted for Ford over Carter when Carter won. Illinois is now basically written off by Republicans because it's such a blue state. So it's the housing patterns, right? So how people live. And if we continue to do that we continue not to talk to people on the other side of the aisle, which is why I think this type of forums are particularly worthwhile. But if we just kind of do our echo chamber on Facebook and Twitter, you can ungerrymander all you like. I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference.
All right. Let me, 10 minutes left. I want to turn to the, as I say, a sneak peek at the Biden administration. Some people thought this would be a blue wave that would lead to Democratic control of the Senate and a larger Democratic majority in the House. Didn't happen. And in fact, President Biden will face an obstacle getting legislation through. So is this a moment when law students should sign up for administrative law? Because this is going to be such an important way in which President Biden will try and get things done through the regulatory process. Kim, you teach that subject. What do you think?
Yeah, again, I was just telling this to my students earlier, absolutely vital. There are more regulations than certainly acts of Congress, and we have a new majority on the Supreme Court that is quite skeptical, and based on the writings of Kavanaugh, for example, Justice Kavanaugh, and others Justice Gorsuch, Justice Thomas, on and on. The notion is essentially Congress, under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress has the power to make laws. They hand that power off to agencies through statutes, and then agencies pass what are called regulations, and they function like laws. Conservatives on the court think that that's a problem, and then we will probably see some pulling back of those administrative law principles. Meanwhile, we have a massive climate change problem. Unlike when Barack Obama took office, we have, I think, a groundswell of more acceptance as this is a serious national security, human rights, basic, the ability to live comfortably issue that we all have to address without a functioning Senate where, substantive legislation moves through, and Mitch McConnell essentially acting as a single unilateral veto, even though he doesn't have that power under the Constitution. What will happen is that if there's going to be, for example, climate change regulation, which Joe Biden has promised to be one of his priorities of his presidency, it's going to have to happen through the regulatory agencies. So people want to see, certainly the people that voted for him want to see that. I think probably on both sides of the aisle, people want to see that. If it happens in administrative state and that goes to the US Supreme Court, we're going to see some conflict, so long as the Senate still is not going to actually work with the Democrats to get stuff done. So yeah, if you're a law student, definitely take administrative law. If you're not, there's a chapter on it in my book.
All right. And Gilda Daniels, tell us, what difference will it make to have a Biden-appointed Attorney General and Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights?
Oh, well, we can start with the Trump administration has brought 0 voting rights cases in its 4 years. And so I think there will be more of a focus on enforcing federal voting rights and other federal laws. And so I certainly think a Biden-appointed Attorney General, as well as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, will make a huge difference in making sure that those laws are enforced.
Yeah. And Charles, how do you think the Republican Senate, assuming that the Georgia races don't result in a 50-50 Senate with Vice President Harris breaking the tie, let's say it's still a Republican Senate, how will they treat, for example, Biden's cabinet nominations? Or let's say there's a Supreme Court vacancy. They didn't consider President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland. Will a Republican Senate bottle up any Supreme Court nomination from a Democratic president?
Oh, to me, there's no doubt at all. When I listen, for example, to the issue of the climate control or environment, what I think of is the Senate with the nomination of the head of EPA. President Biden would surely make a nominee who was a strong anti-pollution person, a strong regulatory person, and above all, strong for taking action on climate control. And that is a nomination that McConnell will be able to hold 51 votes solidly against moving. I think people underestimate what sluggish movement of executive nominees by the Senate will mean. It also, besides leading people who don't get through, there are hundreds of lesser but highly important, the deputy head of each agency, for example, the assistant attorney general, for example. And if McConnell, using the power of the Senate to slow down nominations, holds back these nominees, you'll have a skeleton crew trying to steer the executive branch, which means nothing. They get nothing done.
All right, so those Georgia elections are pretty important. Gilda, you're following the litigation. Is there anything in the current litigation in Georgia that's going to affect the Senate runoff on January 5th?
No, right now it is, people have the ability to request their vote by mail ballots. They can still request vote by mail ballots. We are working to see if they can expand drop boxes, because it will be the actual election is January 5th. So certainly looking, asking to expand early voting, as well as drop boxes so people can actually access their right to vote during
All right,
this.
well, that answers a question from the audience. And I'll ask another one. One of our audience members, a Professor Colin Starger, asks us to consider the difference, the question of, is the United States a democracy or a republic? Kind of lofty question here, but it comes up. It's an undercurrent of some of what we've been talking about in terms of how individuals are chosen to represent the citizenry. So I'll ask each of you, are we moving, some of us think that we're a democracy. Is that a wrong-headed way of understanding our constitutional system? Who wants to tackle that first?
Okay, can I start? So, I mean, we're certainly not a democracy in a sense that term was understood in, I guess, classical Greek. We don't put every proposal before the plebiscite and have them vote on it, and the majority wins. So in that sense, we are a republic. We're a democratic republic. But ultimately, I think that, although Mike Lee's, Senator Lee's from Utah, his words got misinterpreted, and I think, unfairly so. But ultimately, I think he said what I tend to agree with. He said, look, democracy is simply a mechanism to get to the ultimate goal. Democratic kind of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom to vote, freedom of religion. Those are all just a method to get to our ultimate goal of liberty, of individual liberty. And an ability to flourish economically, socially, politically, individually, etc. And so we need the democratic institutions. We need free elections. We need trust in the fact that those elections run well. We need, on some issues, for example, government staff in the Senate to cooperate with the White House and vice versa. But in a context of, getting to the ultimate goal of liberty in a structured Republican system.
Kim, are you concerned that the undemocratic features of the Constitution, the Senate, the Supreme Court, which of course is not itself meant to be a democratic body, are these features of the Constitution kind of threatening the notion of an American democracy?
Yeah, I do think that we're in an extraordinary, like always, I guess, I think one thing that has dawned on a lot of people is how fragile American democracy is. And I think Americans assume it's sort of going to be there just like the sun comes up the next day. But it is, as the famous Ben Franklin quote, it's a republic if you can keep it, right? And what's the difference? The republic has representatives. A pure democracy would be, we all count the votes. I do think, that's a question for political theorists and et cetera, but I do think there is still this foundational, fundamental concept that it's government by we the people, not government by we the powerful, not government by a monarch who's ordained through God. And that fundamental distinction, I think, is being lost a bit. There are many, we could talk for I could go on for an hour independently talking about the structural problems, including at the Supreme Court, which really, really undermine our democratic process. But having thought about this and written a lot, I also write for Politico and Atlantic and all these places for now several years. I think one of the foundational misunderstandings right now has to do with polarization is this notion that to protect, as Greg talks about, your own liberty, the best way to do that is to be on your team. You're on team red or team blue, and it's kind of like a sports team, do or die my team. And that's not the way to think about this, really. It's team we the people. It's team we all of our rights are protected, then we are protected from an overbearing government that has too much power and then starts exercising it in an arbitrary way. And that is the foundational, logical, common sense, human-focused, I think, reality that a lot of people are losing or have lost in this moment of extraordinary polarization.
So Kim says American democracy is fragile. How do we protect it? What's the remedy here? Kim exhorts us to think more of ourselves as the United States of America, not red states and blue states. What can we do as law professors, as educators, to strengthen the democracy? Charles, you have a thought about the role of legal education in remedying some of these ills?
I'm afraid I don't have the solution, although if you give me 5 minutes, I'll...
All right, well, we'll turn to Gilda. Perhaps for the last word, because we're coming up on 6 o'clock. How do you see the state of American democracy and what law professors and soon-to-be lawyers can do about it.
Well, I think central to democracy is the right to vote. And I think that we need to push for an affirmative right to vote. Certainly in the United States Constitution is one thing that we can all do. And I think what was demonstrated on November 3rd, and certainly during the early voting period, was the we the people. And I think that as long as we concentrate, whether you want to call it a democracy or a republic, or if we can one day certainly achieve being a true democracy, it will depend on we the people. And we the people need to participate and also realize that the work begins after the election, right? That we have to make sure that that the persons that we elect are representing us and that we hold them accountable. And I think that makes us, that's what makes us a true democracy.
Well, and to look at the sort of the bright side here, there was tremendous civic involvement. I mean, the level of participation in the election is very exciting to see so many Americans engaged. And then at a micro level, good attendance at this event tells us there's interest in these issues. People want to talk about it, people want to ask questions, people want to debate. And I appreciate the discussion we've had here. Last word from anybody, any of the panelists?
I did actually want to follow up on that question of democracy, which is that some scholars think that we only had a short period of time when Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was actually functioning where we did have a real democracy. I mean, when the Constitution was ratified, it was only landed white males who could actually vote. And that voting tent has just been very stingily opened. And even with, the enfranchisement of formerly enslaved males, with the enfranchisement of women, et cetera, there has still been this undercurrent of only the right people should exercise their right to vote. So some would argue that until we solve this problem of voter suppression, which we saw blatantly in this campaign, the way to stay in power is to keep people from accessing the ballot box, unabashed, I think, from the Republican side. And I say that from having been on panels with longstanding Republicans who admit that is the strategy. Until we address that and actually bring everyone into the voter tent, I'm not so sure we can call ourselves truly a democracy.
All right.
Ron, if I could have like 15 seconds, just kind of.
You 15 seconds.
15 seconds. So I think there's an issue before voting, and I think it's kind of engaged population and sort of listening to the other side. I agree with Kim. It is ultimately all Team America, but in order for us to be Team America, we have to listen to people on the left and people on the right, and not kind of try to protest when somebody is trying to speak. You can protest, but you should at least give people an opportunity to speak. And so that it all begins with that. Unless we hear each other, I think the rest is all academic.
I agree with that. And I think I'm sure we've got consensus on this panel for the proposition that we need to listen respectfully to all views and try to find the common ground. So I appreciate our panelists very much. Excellent conversation. So much we could have covered. We did our best to cover much of it. Future discussions will hit other aspects. And I thank our audience members for being here. I thank our communications director, Christine Stutz, Jason Keller, who assists, and everyone who helps make the UB Law in Focus series so successful. So thank you all very much for participating, and have a great evening.